It is my pleasure to introduce John Kennedy. Most of you probably know him, but John is one of our partners and certified financial planners here at CanderPath. And with years of experience in assisting clients with budgeting, John knows there's a specific niche when it comes to budgeting for retirement or the approach to it. And it's most definitely a phase of life where financial strategies often require special attention. So, without further ado, I'll hand it over the floor to John to guide us through to today's discussion.
Thanks, Raina. That was lovely. Yeah, and like Raina said, Raina, make sure you can monitor the chat too for me, just so I don't miss anything. But we'll do our best to get to the questions at the end, as you have questions. And my goal for today is not to fire hose you with budgeting information, but there are going to be a lot of tips and ideas, and it's informed through decades really of research and trial and error and working with retirees between myself, Matt Marcoux, and Michael Scott. And so something that I've learned in doing with budgeting, and you all know this, but I feel like society kind of primes us to be in this mentality of buy now, pay later. Vernacular that a lot of us have heard, or a term that a lot of us have heard, is keeping up with the Joneses. And each and every one of you that are here today, I've had the privilege of working with you, whether I've been your lead advisor or Matt or Michael has. You didn't get here by accident. The wealth accumulation that you've seen in your life, either if you're in retirement now, or we have a few of you that are like that I know for a fact are within 12 months of retirement. And so you're either leading into retirement or already there. And that didn't happen by accident. That was a lot of hard work. That was diligence. That was accountability. That was saving. And you're not going to be surprised to hear me say that budgeting is probably not only just as important, but I would say more important in retirement than in your working years. And the main reason for that is, during your working years, especially those final few years leading into retirement, you can make some budgetary mistakes and cover it up with cash flow. Maybe you get a bonus later or something like you can cover up budgetary mistakes. But when you're in retirement, you really can't afford to do that. In fact, what that usually looks like in retirement is if we made a budgetary mistake, we have to take from the portfolio, which is kind of like borrowing from future years to pay for present expenses. So it's really, really important. And something else that I want to mention, we're not going to spend too much talking about portfolio. It's going to be a budgeting conversation, but I do want to start a little bit with the investment side, because I can't help myself. But during your accumulation years, when you're growing and adding, you've probably heard all of us talk about this term dollar cost averaging, systematically adding to your investments like your 401k and that type of thing. It is in retirement, you're kind of doing the same thing, but the opposite. It's called reverse dollar cost averaging. You're taking from the portfolio. And we want to see folks take on a systematic basis when we're taking portfolio withdrawals and not big one-time chunks from your investments. There's two reasons for that. One, I find that they both have to do with the psychology of money, but one is you tend to just spend more. If you get like a big chunk from your portfolio, you tend to spend that down a little bit faster than if you got that broken up over, let's say, periodic, monthly installments. And two, it's a little bit of our psychology around how we frame and look at the investments. So just for a moment, entertain this slide here. And I know this is a different way to talk about your portfolio. Usually you're used to us like showing you this big chart, this pie graph of like how much stocks and how much bonds. But a way that we like to frame this for retirees is giving yourself what we call a market buffer. And so if I start from the right side and then move down to the left side, we've got our long-term assets, which are like our growth equities, stocks. Then we've got dividend and value oriented in the intermediate. And we like to keep, for a lot of our retirees, up to a year of short-term assets like treasury bills, treasury notes, or money markets. And there's a reason for that. And the reason is, think back to 2020. That feels like for some like forever ago, but also feels like a second ago. March of 2020, the stock market dropped 35% in 3 weeks. It was the most unprecedented drop we had ever seen in the market. So this bucket of money for folks dropped 35%. This stayed at zero during that time. And what's interesting, if you just held on to your asset allocated plan, this was actually positive by about 7% at the end of that year. This was still at zero, but you at least bought yourself some time because you had these consistent, stable value assets where you don't have to worry, gosh, I'm taking distributions from my portfolio and I'm pulling them out when they're at a loss. this is just a different way to look at it and frame it, but I just want you to kind of think of it like there's a layer of separation between your long-term assets, even in retirement, because we're purposefully building this short-term bucket of money that's ultimately flowing into your checking account and coupled with Social Security pensions and that type of thing. So two things to think about as I show you what I'm about to show you. Number one, just keep an open mind for some of the things I'm going to share when it comes to budgeting. And number two, just know that budgeting is a dirty word, but there is an easier way. And so hopefully we can find an easier way for folks. This is how, what I'm about to show you is how most people do it. And it's kind of this no rhyme or reason, like things sort of stack up and change over time. And our financial life gets more complicated as we get into, approach retirement and then get into retirement. And so we have all these different moving parts. So for most of you, if you're in retirement now, of course, you've got Social Security, maybe a pension, maybe some rental income, and certainly investment income. And all of that's kind of funneling into your main checking account. And then from your checking account, you're paying for expenses, right? Like you probably have auto draft set up. If you still have a mortgage that you're paying your healthcare, your Medicare premiums. And so that stuff's coming out on a monthly consistent basis. And then for everything else, you've got credit cards, and you probably got a credit card for a good reason at the time. It was like 5% cash back for groceries at one point in time. And then you did what most people do, which is you don't have one credit card, you have multiple credit cards, because there was a reason at the time that happened and it made sense, but it starts to become more complicated. And furthermore, on top of all this, we're writing checks from our checking account for various situations. And then last but not least, we're cycling money into our savings account and then back out of our savings account. And we're hopefully putting that in there as a rainy day for an emergency or something like that. And money's kind of cycling all around here. And what ends up happening at some point in the budgeting scenario for folks is this account starts to run low. And the problem is we've got a fixed sum of dollars coming into from your retirement assets or Social Security coming into your account. And so what do? Well, in this scenario, we lean on credit cards. We end up spending more. And now we've got this scenario where, and I as crazy as it sounds, and I don't think this is going to be that shocking of a statistic, but the average person carries a $6,000 balance on their credit card. Not that they spend $6,000 a month on their credit card, they're carrying a balance, which means they're paying APR, they're paying an APR to that. And I know you all know this that are on this call, but if we're making investment decisions and I'm comparing like rates of return in the portfolio to an APR, we want to make sure that APR is paid off, because usually it's somewhere between 18 to 24%. I mean, it's a very, very high number. Right now, I'm going to take a quick pause real quick because I just want to, I realize I'm monitoring the join list, and I want to make sure I add everybody in here while I'm talking because I was not looking at that. Okay. All right. I'm back. So it's this very chaotic system that we end up creating for ourselves. And it slowly builds to that. But in this scenario, if you're trying to apply a budget to this, it's so like when you put a budget on paper, it's already kind of happened. Like it's very reactionary. You're looking at the past expenses, and it's this very reactionary thing to this like living, breathing, moving, there's payments for credit cards and money's flowing in and out and all over the place. So part of what I want to frame for you today is what if there was an easier way to how we view and manage our money? And I'm going to talk about this a lot, these three specific things. So I want to use this terminology now so you hear it, where I talk about fixed expenses, flexible, which would be like variable expenses, and future expenses. So hopefully, and I'm gonna share this throughout the conversation too. Obviously, this is not a real client. I would never do this to somebody. But hopefully, if you're on this call, you are not only have access to this dashboard, but you're using our MyPath dashboard. It is such a great tool to be able to go in here and you can link up all of those different accounts and help you start with just monitoring what these expenses are and creating a little bit of awareness. So I'm going to go back to that in a moment. But first, let me start with the fixed account. So I'm going to kind of explain how we do this with a lot of our retirees and how my wife and I have done this for over 10 years. So I'm a very visual learner. Raina, you know that about me for sure. So I'm gonna just bear with me as I try to kind of draw through some of this stuff. So the first thing that we have, like we've already talked about, we've got our main checking account, right? And that's where our dollars flow into. And from our main checking account, we're paying for all of these various expenses. The big thing that we do in our household and I do with retirees is I say, our first step is let's create separation between our fixed expenses and our flexible expenses. And so we identify all of our fixed expenses, and they come out of one main source, so that main checking account that we have. And I bet you if I asked you now to put pen to paper, I won't do that because I won't put anybody on the spot. But if I asked you to put pen to paper and write a list of what this looks like for you, this is what everybody conjures up in their mind. Like they remember their fixed expenses. That's the easy part. The hard one is your flexible expenses, those variable ones like your entertainment and dining, and grocery and gas. Those things fluctuate and move throughout the month depending on what you're doing and just how life is changing. And so what we do is we say, okay, on a weekly basis, we transfer money to a second checking account. And again, it's on a weekly basis. And this is what we define as our flexible account. So now what we've done essentially is we've created two distinct accounts where we can monitor our fixed and our flexible. And we give ourselves an amount, almost like an allowance. And you can think of this, for everyone on this call, you all know who Dave Ramsey is, and you've all heard of the envelope system, like the cash envelope system. This is kind of like the digitized version of the cash envelope system. And again, there's going to be aspects to this that you're probably going to challenge me on and ask me questions on later, and that's okay. My goal is for you to adopt one or two of these things. But okay, so to this point, we've created a physical separation of our fixed and our flexible expenses. Now, what we do is we move money over on a weekly basis, and I talk to clients about this a lot, the idea of like spending up versus spending down. So why haven't I talked about credit cards yet? Well, in our household, and Rain is smiling because she knows what I'm about to say, and she does some of this too in her household. We use this second checking account, and we use a debit card for these purchases. There's two main reasons that we do that. Number one, there have been studies that suggest that the average family spends approximately 15% less over the course of the year when they do not use credit cards. Why is that? Well, we're more connected to our purchase in that way. Like you act in real time. If you're making a purchase, you have to decide like, is this a want or is this a need? Versus when you put it on a credit card, I don't know about you guys, but I've done this before with credit cards. It's very easy to get in this trap of like, future John and Jackie will deal with this problem. Like we'll figure out how to pay that credit card next month or in 40 days when that thing's due. We're fine now. We'll just swipe and we'll move on with life. But when you spend down, there's a very visceral reaction and connection to your dollars because you're seeing this account balance go to zero. Like there's actual consequence for that to go to zero. There's an even greater consequence if you spend up by putting it on credit cards because then you have APR and you're paying off interest. That's different, but that delays this, whereas this is more connected and the consequences felt more immediately. So for us, this flexible account, this looks like all of our, and I'm going to show you a list of examples of expenses, but this looks like for us, it's entertainment, it's dining, it's gas, it's grocery, and we give ourselves essentially a weekly allowance to spend from and on these things. And the last one that I'm going to talk about, this is your future account. This is going to be a savings account. So essentially at this point, we've got two checking accounts and one savings account. And I know what a lot of you are probably thinking because a lot of people like their credit cards. They like the points. And so far, I have not talked about using a credit card in our household because we don't. We use it in one specific capacity, which is in our savings account, which is our future account, which I'll explain in a second. But I already know one of the questions that will be asked, so let me address it ahead of time. For the folks using a debit card for your flexible expenses, the big one that I get is, well, what if that debit card gets compromised? That's probably the most valid counter argument to using a credit card and not using a debit card. Because I would, if you go back to my example of saving 15%, like spending 15% less over the course of the year, I would much rather save 15% than get like 1 to 3% in cash back. But a very valid argument is like, okay, I go swipe my debit card at the gas station and it gets swiped, there's a card reader and it's exposed to risk. I will agree with that point. My counter argument is hopefully we've got a waterline mark of in our flexible account that you shouldn't have 4,000 or 10,000 or 20,000 in this flexible account. It should be the amount weekly that you need to spend for these variable things that you have going on in your life. And so you're not exposing a high sum of dollars relative to your total net worth to this risk of your card being swiped, number one. Number two, how do I want to say this? It works, it's similar but different. Like with a credit card company, you can dispute it much quicker and easier. I get that. But with a debit card with your bank, you are still able to dispute those expenses. So there's money at risk, but hopefully it's much less, and you're still able to dispute them the same way you can with a credit card. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of peace of mind, and we can talk through that more, Raina, if we have questions at the end. And then, so last but not least, on a monthly basis, we sweep money over to this escrow account, this future bucket of money. This could look like a vacation. This could look like traveling to go see your kids and your grandkids. This could be home improvements that you've been wanting to make in the home that you've lived in for a long time. And you're like, hey, I'm looking around, I want to do these things, but we got a budget for them, right? And what we're trying to avoid with this future account is we're trying to escrow for things ahead of time. So we're preparing for point of purchase to happen, and that money's already in an account, versus point of purchase occurs and now we're like slowly having to pay back an interest rate potential, like an APR, along with a payment to get this thing paid off. So that's a really big deal as far as control for us. Now, where credit cards come into play in my household, because I just said a second ago, I don't use them. I don't use them for this account here. I just don't. I don't use credit cards for variable expenses. I use our credit cards for these pre-planned, escrowed future expenses that pop up in our house. So when my family and I goes on a vacation, well, we have a card it's like a Marriott Bonvoy card that has points. That's the card that we use. But because I've already prepared and saved for it in that account, I immediately pay for it on the credit card, and then I just pay it right off. I don't carry a balance. And most of you probably don't, but hopefully this gives you some mechanisms for a little bit more of, I would say, an accounting of how your money flows. So one thing that I want to mention in the form of these slides and in conversation, I want to go back to your MyPath client dashboard. So you're probably listening to all this going like, great, okay, got it. Like 2 checking accounts and a savings account, that's not that hard. Some of you are probably having a hard time with letting go of credit cards, which we can totally talk through, and that's totally respectable. But like, how do we do it? So my first goal, as I mentioned with MyPath, is creating some level of awareness in your financial situation. This is not meant to be an exercise of shaming, of like looking at your budget. Like, you might have some credit card balances that you're carrying right now that you're working on paying off. That tells us that you're spending more than you're receiving in income. We can work through that and figure that out, though. The whole point of this is an exercise of awareness. We want to know, you can't not look at this stuff. Like, I have a lot of times I talk with folks who are like, John, I'm just not good at money. Like, I'm not good at money. I don't like, looking at my budget. I don't like seeing how much I spend. To which I reply, like, that's fine, but that doesn't mean that it's not happening. Like, it's still happening, whether you choose to look at it or you're choosing to ignore it. And so we provide these tools for a reason, to make it very easy. And so again, this is just an example, but you can see here for this person that Thomas and Morgan Parker that we have linked up. So we've got an account pulling through transactions. Like, you're able to go in here and link up your savings accounts, your checking accounts, your credit cards, and just feed this data in, and then go back. And this is what I would say is step one for a budget, is go back and just look at the last 90 days of expenses. Go through here. It's super easy to categorize things. You can click on a button. You can make the change. You can even permanently change it. So like, let me find a good one. Like if Chipotle here, let's say it was coming up as coffee for some reason, I can select restaurants and dining, and I can make a rule that every time Chipotle comes up, it's going to come up as restaurants and dining going forward. So now you've got all of this organized and categorized, let's say for just the last 90 days. That's the goal, to get a kind of a baseline. And now we can go in here and you can actually see how much did we spend on these different categories. And right now, just for the sake of this example, a lot of this stuff is just is what I would call flexible expenses for this particular example client. But you can see how much that spending is. We can go back in the last 90 days and we can see, okay, great. Like we've got a really good idea that we've spent a lot of money on food over the last 90 days. What's going on with that? Is that the norm or is that out of the norm? And why is that? The second step that we preach with our clients is, because monitoring all in here is good, but there has to be a little bit of an exercise of pen to paper, let's say, like just writing it out. Maybe, I don't know what it is, Raina, but for me, it's like there's this like feeling, it just feels good to like check things off like a checklist and like write things out and kind of create this like static visual. So what my wife and I do, and what I do with a lot of retirees, is step number one, we go through the past expenses to see what is been kind of the normal trend for the last 3 months or so. Then we put pen to paper and we create some expectations for ourselves. So we go in and we'll give you access to this template as well. Of course, the MyPath dashboard. So, and reach out to Raina if you have any issues logging into it or connecting to it. She's got you covered on how to get all that stuff set up. But going in this Google Sheets and then working through literally pen to paper, writing this out. What are my fixed expenses? What are all my flexible expenses? And you can see here, we've kind of got just a list of examples, if you will, for what that looks like. And what are the future things that I'm trying to escrow towards? And once you enter all of this information in, which, Raina, I'm kind of excited to hear your opinion on this, because I know you did this recently in preparation for this call. Once you enter all of this in, then we come to the summary page and we can see what all of this actually looks like. And really in real time, just see like, are we spending more or are we in line with what we're receiving as far as an income? So again, 2 great tools, just using this template and using our MyPath client dashboard. And there's a plethora of online options too that people have used over the years for like online budgeting apps and such. This is what we do. So I'm sharing what we do, what we know, and what I have seen work with clients. Part of the reason it's because it's our software, so we're comfortable with it. And this is a template that I built, so it's a lot easier to talk through this stuff with clients. So it's certainly a fun and worthwhile conversation. So again, step 1, awareness. Step 2, write it down. And before we go to some questions, which we're wrapping early, so I talked fast. But before we go to some questions, I want to at least mention a couple of things here that I think are just some really important tidbits and rules, especially in retirement, because like I said at the beginning of this stuff is so important. It's probably the most important. It's like within your day-to-day finances, this is the thing you have control over in retirement. It's such an important aspect. So number 1, let's avoid financing things that are not going to pay us. So if we've got credit cards, let's talk later. Let's figure out a strategy to make sure those things are being paid off and we're not carrying a balance at the minimum. I'm going to jump to number 3. I'm going to go back to number 2 in a second. Physically creating that separation of your fixed and your flexible expenses. How you do it is totally up to you. Today's kind of effort was to show you what works for us. If it looks like putting all of your fixed expenses throughout your main checking account, and then your variable flexible on a credit card, that's fine, as long as you're able to be diligent enough to pay that off each month and still monitor it. I know because studies have proven it, and I'm like living proof in my own household that spending down an account is better than spending up a credit card balance that you see just kind of going up and up and up. But it's the bigger goal that I want to get across here in this conversation is creating that physical separation. Back to number 2, I have here, remember the 24-hour rule, but I didn't talk about it. So let's talk about it now. The 24-hour rule is drawing a line in the sand for and this is scalable to your situation. So let's say it's $500 or more. Every time in your household you make a purchase decision that exceeds $500, whether that's you or between you and your spouse or what happens, just sit on it for 24 hours, sleep on that decision to determine, is this really something that we need, or is this something that we want? And even if after a day you determine it's something that you need, maybe by sitting on it for a day, you've given yourself the opportunity to say, okay, like we're gonna wait for a sale, we're gonna shop this thing around. We're not just gonna like pull the trigger on Amazon. Lord knows it's so easy to go on Amazon with like a one-click buy and just buy something that they've purposely made it very easy for you to spend more instead of being diligent about a decision. So the 24-hour rule in our household is something that we live by. And then of course, last but not least, I know I've already said this, so this is kind of an echo of what I've said so far, but really, try to leverage our resources. You can scan the QR codes here. So we've got our MyPath client dashboard on the far right. And actually that QR code takes you to, we've got some really great tools on where is it here? On our website. And there's a lot of walkthroughs, specifically me kind of walking through, which I did this today with you already, so you don't need to watch this one, but like walking through the cash flow and the budgeting. There's one of Raina kind of troubleshooting your logins, and with Matt repairing your connection. So it's really good resource. Make sure you're using your MyPath client dashboard. And we started an e-course that it's kind of like in soft launch mode now, I think would be like the better way to say it. But we have an e-course. It's not something that we're selling by any means, but I would say if any of this resonated to you and you're like, gosh, this is great. Like I wish my, adult son or daughter would, jump on a webinar like this to go through budgeting. That's what this course was designed with, that intent in mind, to be able to like give it to a family member and say, hey, this is the Your Money Flows is just one segment of the Your Money story. So there's several components of building your wealth and different investment accounts and that type of thing. So it's a fun course, but we finished inside of a half an hour, which is like maybe 5 or 10 minutes sooner than I expected. So I talk fast when we're actually doing it and we're not doing the dry run through. But Raina, do you have any questions? I didn't see any Q&A come through, which just means I must have just done a thorough job at explaining.
Yeah, I think you've done a fantastic job. I know that one thing that resonated with me the most is the 24-hour rule, because if you know anything about me, it's that I'm impulsive, and if I want some shoes, I'm gonna get some shoes. So me and my husband have both agreed that if I can wait on certain stuff, he can also wait on all of his tennis equipment that he wants.
I
So
love
we've
it.
created that 24-hour rule, thankfully, because of you, John.
I love
Should
it.
I be
I love it.
thinking?
Can you
Yeah,
still hear
so
me?
yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, but my Zoom screen froze, which is kind of crazy. So I don't know what happened, but as long as you can hear me, that's fine. I don't know if you can see me still, but we can keep
Oh yeah,
talking. Okay,
I can
good.
see you, and you're moving around.
Good.
Well, I did have just a couple of questions that I feel like may be good for the majority, if not, fine. But I know that you didn't want to touch too much on credit cards, but I also just want to reiterate some, like, what are the red flags that we're looking for in credit cards specifically?
Yeah.
If we still have them, or we're shopping around for a different one, or trying to consolidate.
No, that's an awesome question. I would say number one, the big thing we're trying to avoid is carrying a credit card that has any kind of fee. I mean, I know that seems logical that someone would know that, but a lot of times in your working years, maybe you had a credit card for, if you traveled a lot, you had a credit card for flights and points, and you paid a fee for that. And then you got into retirement, you just kind of got in the habit of keeping that credit card. That's a good thing to audit. Ideally, we're not carrying balances on our cards, so we shouldn't have to worry too much about the APR, because they're all going to be high. They're not ideal, but making sure we're not paying a fee for our credit card, that's huge.
Yeah. Lee asked, is there a way to create more categories in the budgeting tool? So I
Oh
assume
gosh.
it,
Yeah,
yeah.
Lee, can you clarify for us? Are you referring to in the Google Sheets template, or are you referring to your MyPath client dashboard? But I think in both scenarios, the answer is definitely yes in Google Sheets. It's kind of designed so that it's customizable that way. And I think we can also do that in your MyPath client dashboard, where we can create a different category for you to assign expenses to.
Yeah. Yeah. He said in the dashboard. So
Yeah,
yes.
that's such a good point, Lee. And the other thing I want to mention, there's a way to do this, and my screen totally froze, so I don't think I can show you this right now. But there's a way
Mhm.
to do this where you can separate expenses when you're monitoring it in your MyPath dashboard. So what I mean by that is like, if you go to Costco or Target, some of that's food and grocery, but some of that's household items. Some of that's, you know, it's a catch-all category where it's Target, I think, for example, automatically comes up as merchandise. Well, we can actually divide that out if you want to. So you can double click into that one expense, and then it's a manual process for that point in time, but you could say like, okay, you know, $85 went to grocery and $72 went to miscellaneous or whatever the case is. That's a really good question.
Yeah. I'd asked, would you recommend getting rid of those high interest slash fee credit cards? They used to recommend never canceling because it would influence your credit score.
Oh, that's such a good question. So let's talk offline about your specific situation just to make sure we get it right. You're correct in some sense. When you cancel a credit card, temporarily, when you close that card down, it will temporarily lower your credit score. So I want to be mindful of, if we cancel a card, what card are we canceling? Like, is it the card that you have the longest standing credit history with? I probably wouldn't want to do that. Is it a card that you opened up 3 years ago because it was like you know, a Nordstrom card or like a Kohl's card or something like a department store? Those ones we could probably consider canceling. For what it's worth, we still have, and I carry a credit card in my wallet, and we still have, it's not that I've so much canceled or closed my credit card. We just don't use it. It's there for like an emergency situation, or if like my debit card's not working or something like that, we still carry it. So I want to be careful just to make sure I'm advocating for not using credit cards. Doesn't mean necessarily closing out the credit cards, if that makes sense.